She was just the old woman in the back row, the one in the faded green uniform with a medal no one recognized and a name tag half peeled from age. "Probably lost," one officer whispered. "We're just here for the free coffee," another laughed as they passed. No one asked why she stood alone outside the leadership seminar at 0630 sharp, back straight as a rifle, hands folded calmly behind her. No one cared, until the moment the colonel paused at the entrance, spotted her, and snapped to attention before anyone else could move. And then the room went still. She didn't return the salute. She just opened a worn envelope, the one she'd carried untouched for 29 years, and placed it on the table next to her untouched name placard. Inside were two things: a faded photo of a younger Colonel Mathers standing at her side in the jungle, and a metal case no one in that building had ever seen open before. If you believe that real leadership is quiet, patient, and unforgettable, like and subscribe. Because sometimes, the loudest lesson in the room isn't the one with the mic, it's the one you tried to ignore. They called her ma'am, once, at the front desk, but it was more out of policy than respect. Sergeant First Class Lila Hartley had arrived 20 minutes early to the Joint Forces Leadership Seminar, her uniform spotless but clearly older than half the officers walking past her. No convoy brought her, no entourage announced her. She simply stepped out of a battered 1994 sedan with veteran tags, her Class A jacket pressed flat, a soft scar down her right cheek, and a single campaign ribbon glinting faintly under the morning sun. She took her seat near the back, row 7, aisle, near the wall, and waited. Some didn't even glance at her. Others, mostly the junior lieutenants, exchanged looks that bordered on ridicule, unsure whether she was somebody or just somebody's plus one. It was Lieutenant Ashford who first made the joke. "Lost your way, Grandma," he muttered, nudging his buddy beside him. The other man, Lieutenant Vale, chuckled behind his palm. "Think she's here to lecture us on bayonet drills?" Lila didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. Her eyes remained fixed on the podium, her posture still perfect, her boots planted like she was back on parade. Around her, the buzz of conversation rose: strategies, assignments, who was likely to speak, which colonel would push what doctrine, but none of it touched her. Not even when someone took a photo and sent it around in the officer group chat, captioned, "Ghost of Gulf War Past." She'd seen worse, heard worse, married worse. One young specialist, Jules, seated 3 rows ahead, turned back more than once. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way she sat, unmoving, almost statuesque. Maybe it was the way she scanned the exits instinctively, like someone trained to expect trouble. Or maybe it was the name on her patch, Hartley, that stirred something. The door opened at 0730 sharp. Everyone snapped into formation posture, chins lifted, shoulders squared. Colonel Mathers entered like a storm held in check. Bronze stars gleamed across his chest. His voice was sharp, his eyes sharper. But something shifted when he spotted Lila. He froze mid-step. The chatter stopped. Officers leaned in. Some stood straighter, unsure why. And then he saluted. A full, crisp, ceremonial salute. Not to a peer, not to a guest, but to her. And still, she didn't move. Instead, she reached down and slowly unlatched her satchel, retrieving a weathered envelope sealed with red wax. She laid it on the desk beside her, and only then did she rise. The envelope bore the stamp of the Department of the Army and a line in neat handwriting, "To be opened upon my final return to base." Every eye in the room followed it as Colonel Mathers walked toward her, his boots somehow softer now. "Sergeant First Class Hartley," he said, voice like gravel softened by memory, "you should have let us do this years ago." Lila shook her head. "I was never waiting for a ceremony," she replied quietly. "I just wanted them to learn before they lead." He turned to the crowd. "You all think you're about to learn something from me. But first, you'll listen to her." The silence that followed was dense. No one laughed now. Lieutenant Ashford stared at the floor. Vale blinked hard. And Specialist Jules was already searching her name in the archived registries. The seminar didn't begin with charts. It began with a story, one no one had read. One etched quietly in the muscles of a woman who had spent a lifetime doing the work no one wrote about, leading men who never came back, keeping secrets that never reached the news, and teaching by simply existing with dignity that didn't ask to be recognized. That day, the lecture hall learned more in one moment of uncomfortable silence than they had in months of doctrine. And they would never forget the woman in row 7, aisle seat, who had waited 29 years not for a salute, but for them to finally pay attention. And now they did. The seminar's second morning began not with commands for protocols, but with whispers more careful now, but no less cruel. Word had traveled fast after Colonel Mather's salute. The most of the officers still didn't know why he did it. No bio, no intro, no LinkedIn profile. Just a moment, frozen and unforgettable, that didn't match anything in their training manuals. Yet even after that silent reverence, some remained too proud or too insecure to sit with the lesson. In the early hours, as the officers gathered for coffee and briefing assignments, Lieutenant Ashford muttered to Lieutenant Vale with a defensive shrug, "Maybe she's the colonel's aunt or something. We're brides get ribbons too." They laughed, but quieter this time. The jokes weren't shouted anymore, just seated carefully like landmines in passing conversations. Lila, once again seated near the back of the hall, gave no indication she heard them. Her uniform was the same, pressed and deliberate, but her position had changed. This time, chairs filled up farther from her, like her presence was now radioactive. Not mockery exactly, just discomfort disguised as distance. And yet, even that couldn't drown the rising curiosity. Specialist Jules hadn't stopped researching. He stayed up late digging through dusty databases and redacted PDFs until he found one declassified article clipped from a 1994 military journal. SFCL, partly, first and last voice in the comm line, it read. The photo was grainy, but unmistakable. Her eyes hadn't changed. Neither had the way she stood, alert, guarded, still as a statue while others blurred around her. He looked around the room that morning and couldn't understand how no one else saw it. Colonel Mathers had barely spoken of her after that first salute. He simply moved forward with the lecture, his tone colder, sharper, no longer tolerating even half-hearted smirks. But the change wasn't just in him. It was in how Lila's silence began to reshape the air. In every meeting that followed, her eyes scanned each briefing slide like she was auditing it, not for grammar or formatting, but for battlefield logic. When the discussion turned to rapid extraction scenarios, she raised her hand once. Just once. And said 5 words. "Where's your communication redundancy plan?" The room fell awkwardly silent. A junior officer fumbled to answer, referencing a slide on mobile encryption. She nodded once and lowered her hand. "Cell towers go down in 10 seconds under EMP, she said softly. "You want paper maps and a ham operator." No one spoke for a beat. Then Colonel Mathers muttered, "Continue." But everyone was still watching her. The next day, 2 of the lieutenants started keeping notebooks. One tried to strike up conversation. "What unit were you with, ma'am?" he asked during lunch. She took a sip of water, looked at him, and said only, "The kind that didn't advertise." And that was all. Word began to spread that Hartley wasn't just an old vet. She was the Hartley, the one from that blackout op in Panama, the one who held an unsecured perimeter for 48 hours with a comm rig wired out of 2 stolen batteries and a car antenna. The one who led without being asked. The whispers shifted. "Wait, that's her," came the murmurs. "She taught comms in Kabul, didn't she?" Others weren't so sure. They kept their distance, unwilling to be seen, sucking up to the past. But the arrogance had started to fray. It began at the field strategy breakout when Lila was invited, reluctantly, to observe. Captain Barrington asked her, "Anything to add?" with the kind of smirk that pretended to be open-minded but reeked of doubt. She stood slowly, walked to the map, and shifted free unit markers with deliberate fingers. "If your evac route overlaps with your fuel staging zone," she said, "you're either out of gas or out of soldiers." A quiet fell. She sat down. Colonel Mathers leaned back in his chair and said, "Noted." After that, she was no longer dismissed, but she wasn't quite accepted either. There was a tension in the air, a mix of shame and resistance, as if admitting she knew more would invalidate years of command posturing. They started watching what they said when she was near. They stopped laughing in the halls. Even Ashford grew quiet, though his pride flickered like a dying pilot light. One afternoon, he tried again. "Ma'am," he said, voice forced polite, "where did you really serve?" She looked at him, just for a second too long, then replied, "Where your GPS doesn't work and your rank doesn't matter." He blinked, unsure if it was a rebuke or a memory. She didn't explain. Didn't need to. Meanwhile, Specialist Jules was still connecting dots. He started asking his instructors why Lila Hartley wasn't in their leadership modules. No one gave a straight answer. One NCO just said, "Some stories get buried to protect egos." Another said, "She was never big on medals, only results." And in the evenings, Jules would sit across the mess hall and watch how she moved, how she never stood in line but always seemed to get her tray last, how no one joined her, yet she never seemed alone. The few who dared to sit near her said she gave off a weight you couldn't quite define, Like she wasn't remembering war but measuring people. Every breath she took felt like it carried names. And that's when the respect began to bloom, not in applause, not in apologies, but in the way people started asking quieter questions, and the way young officers took longer to speak in front of her. And the way the seminar suddenly seemed to revolve around what she might say, even when she didn't. She hadn't come for recognition. She hadn't come to lecture. She came, as she put it in the margin of a notepad someone later found, to see what kind of leaders were still raising in peacetime. Her silence wasn't passive, it was loaded. Her posture wasn't stiff, it was trained. And her eyes? They didn't just observe. They cataloged, judged, read people better than any background file. She had been mocked, ignored, and misunderstood, but not broken. And now, without raising her voice, she had become the axis around which the entire seminar rotated. And still, she hadn't told her story. Because the story was telling itself, through the way others changed when they thought she wasn't looking. But she was. She always was. It happened on the third morning, quiet, unannounced, the way all real reckonings arrive. The seminar room was colder than usual. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting pale rectangles across the polished concrete floor as officers shuffled in. Most were bleary-eyed from late-night strategy sessions, a few still quietly discussing last night's intel case study, while others filed past Lila with the same guarded half-respect they'd learned to show over the last 48 hours. The air felt dense, not with noise but with tension, like the room itself knew something was about to shift. She sat, as always, in the back row, same seat, back straight, a small, sealed box beside her today. Polished mahogany, simple brass latch, untouched by time. No one asked about it. They didn't dare. Colonel Mathers entered late, not with his usual precise gait, but with a burden in his steps and a folder in his hand that bore the Department of Defense seal. He didn't head for the podium. He headed for her. The conversation in the room stopped mid-sentence, the silence contagious. Then, in front of every officer and enlisted observer, Colonel Mathers snapped to attention and saluted again, this time slower, deeper. She stood, finally returning it. "Sergeant First Class Lila Hartley," he said, his voice quieter than they'd ever heard it. "You've been requested for posthumous medal clarification. Except you're not dead. So today, we correct that." Murmurs flickered in the back of the room, eyes darting. Posthumous. Mathers opened the folder and read from the citation inside, his voice steady despite the emotion pushing at its edges. "Awarded for classified field actions under Operation Warden Sky, Region 9, Northern Theater, communications leadership that saved the lives of 43 soldiers, for commanders, and 1 Marine general under siege with no backup, during a blackout that lasted 16 hours. He paused, looked up. This medal was issued in 1994. She refused it. He turned to the front row, where Ashford and Vale sat stiff as stone. Because she said she wasn't the only one who stayed behind. Mathers stepped aside, and an aide placed the medal box on the table next to her. Inside, the Distinguished Service Cross, third highest military decoration awarded for extraordinary heroism. The room had never seen one outside a museum. "Most of you don't even know what this is," Mathers continued. "Because most of you will never earn it. And that's okay. But you will remember why someone did." He looked at her, and she nodded once, a nod that didn't seek permission, only acknowledgement. Then, for the first time, Lila spoke. Not a correction, not a defense, just truth. "I came here to watch," she said softly. "But watching isn't silence. It's a test." She turned to face the room, her voice like gravel dipped in ice water, aged, but clear. "I've been watching who's ready to carry weight, not rank. Who asks questions when no one's looking? Who checks facts before they speak? That's leadership, and too many of you don't have it yet." She let the silence stand. It didn't need decoration. She took her seat again, box untouched. And in that pause, longer than protocol allowed, something else broke. Ashford rose slowly from his chair. His face flushed red, his voice small. "Ma'am." He stopped himself. There were no words. Not for what he'd said, nor for what he'd failed to see. Lila didn't look at him. She simply folded her hands and said, "You don't apologize to a uniform. You answer to what you become in one." Beside her, Jules sat frozen, notebook open, his pen slowly lowering. He wasn't taking notes anymore. He was witnessing the lesson itself. The seminar never quite recovered. Colonel Mathers didn't resume the lecture. Instead, he dismissed them with one line. If anyone still thinks leadership is loud, you're excused. No one moved. Not one. Later that afternoon, an unplanned change was made to the session schedule. Instead of breakout strategy drills, the officers were invited to a closed-door review titled Operational Ghosts, Lessons from the Field They Don't Teach at West Point. The guest speaker wasn't announced, but when Lila Hartley stepped onto the raised platform with her box finally opened, they rose, not out of order, but instinct, because now they understood. She wasn't a relic. She was a warning, a legacy, a mirror, and they were only just learning how to look into it. They didn't clap. Not at first. When Sergeant First Class Lila Hartley finished her unscripted, blisteringly calm address in the breakout room, no notes, no slides, no mottos, there wasn't applause. Just silence. Deep, respectful, painful silence. The kind that follows a eulogy when everyone realizes the person it was about never needed to die to be mourned. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't pointed fingers, hadn't called anyone out. But they all felt seen. Wait. And many found themselves lacking. Her speech had ended with a single sentence, spoken not to impress, but to instruct. If you don't know the names of the people under you, you're not leading, you're memorizing a chain of command. Then she stepped down. No medals on display. Just that ever-sealed box, now left open in plain view. The Distinguished Service Cross glinted like a quiet judgment beneath the harsh ceiling lights. For the next few minutes, no one knew what to do. Colonel Mathers stood at the rear, arms crossed, face unreadable, as a row of junior officers slowly stood, not to leave, but as if rising in a court of law. Eventually, a ripple started, not a cheer, not a chant, but a respectful nod from officer to officer, from enlisted to senior brass. They began forming a line, not for autographs or handshakes, but just to look inside that box, to witness the medal, to absorb the weight of what had been ignored for decades. No selfies, no smiles. Some saluted, quietly. Others simply bowed their heads. And a few, like specialist jewels, whispered thank yous without making a sound. But one moment stood above the rest. It came when a visiting civilian academic, brought in to evaluate leadership curriculum, stepped forward with hesitation in his eyes and a clipboard in his hand. Sergeant Hartley, he said, voice shaking with your experience. You should have been teaching here for years. She met his gaze, calm, measured, and unsparing. I was, she said. You just didn't have the class listed. His clipboard slowly lowered, and he walked away, stunned. That afternoon, the seminar coordinator revised the day's schedule. Lila wasn't just added to the instructor panel, she replaced two of them. Her new session, Field Leadership When the Radio Dies, Command in Chaos. Attendance was optional. Not a single seat was empty. And in that room, as she described decisions made in darkness, medevacs managed without satellites, and the terror of choosing who gets rescued when there's only one chopper coming, no one took their eyes off her. At one point, Lieutenant Ashford asked about regrets. Do you ever wish you'd done anything differently? He asked, trying to mask his own shame in a professionally worded inquiry. Lila blinked slowly. Yes, she said. I wish I'd spoken sooner. But sometimes silence is the only way to hear who's paying attention. That line, like a scalpel, cut through the last of the pride in the row. Later, they found out that the original citation for her medal had never been distributed beyond top clearance. Not because she didn't deserve it, but because she had requested no ceremony. Let the living eat cake. I've had my fill. That's what she'd written on the back of her recommendation form. They say one major cried when he saw that line, tucked deep in the archival folder, buried under 2 decades of silence. But something changed after that session. The leadership seminar, previously full of theory, hypotheticals, controlled simulations, suddenly felt real. Officers spoke slower. Salutes lasted longer. Not out of fear, but reverence. The kind born not of rules, but of finally understanding who you share a uniform with. Colonel Mathers met with senior command that same night and pushed through a new policy, legacy integration for classified veterans and training environments. Lila's name was never used in the paperwork, but everyone knew. And for the first time, her presence was no longer a reminder of what they'd overlooked. It was a symbol of what the system could become. When she left the building that evening, the sun was setting low across the lot. Her shadow stretched long beside her on the concrete, the only thing keeping pace with the legend she never wanted to be. One young officer, too new to know the whole story, but wise enough to feel its gravity, stood at attention near the door. Thank you for staying, ma'am, he said, hand raised in salute. She paused, tilted her head, and returned it, clean, quiet, and exact. "I never left," she replied. "You just finally showed up." The sun rose differently on the last day. It wasn't just the light, it was the way people moved through it. As officers arrived at the seminar hall for closing remarks, the air was no longer thick with ego or protocol, but something quieter, heavier, reverence. Where once laughter had echoed in corners, now there were only low conversations and the occasional sound of boots clicking against tile as officers stopped to look at the newly framed photo just outside the lecture room, a photo that hadn't been there yesterday. In it, Sergeant First Class Lila Hartley stood beside a communications tent, hair tied under her patrol cap, a field radio on one hip, and a calm defiance in her eyes as explosions lit the tree line behind her. The caption underneath read, "SFC Lila Hartley," held the line when the sky went silent. No fanfare. No title embellishment. Just the truth. And that was all she ever needed. That morning, her seat wasn't in the back row. It was front and center, placed deliberately between the seminar's top brass and visiting faculty. A gold plaque read simply, "Guest Instructor, Legacy Division." She didn't speak at the final panel, not because she wasn't asked, but because she'd already said what mattered. Her silence now was no longer invisible. It was institutional, carried with honor. Colonel Mathers opened the ceremony with a brief statement. "This week," he said, "wasn't about what you already know. It was about what you almost didn't learn in time." He gestured toward Lila without naming her. "This building carries a new lesson now. Not in anchor slides, but in posture, humility, and memory." Then, in an unplanned moment that would later become part of the Academy's oral tradition, Specialist Jules stood. He held a small wooden case, handcrafted overnight by base carpenters, and inside it, the full citation from 1994, printed on archival paper, beside a letter he had written himself. "For every leader who wasn't taught her name," he said quietly, voice cracking, "let this be the first page of their education." He handed it to her with both hands, like an offering. Lila accepted it wordlessly. Her nod carried more meaning than any speech could have. One by one, others rose, officers, instructors, even a civilian contractor who had once rolled his eyes at her presence. They didn't line up to offer praise or apology. They simply stood, as if by standing they could erase their earlier neglect. But she didn't need their penance. She only needed them to be better than they were the day before. That was the lesson, and they knew it now. Outside the hall, a new edition had appeared on the wall of service, the base's modest tribute to veterans who had shaped doctrine and development across generations. Most plaques were bronze, formal, polished, but hers was made of dark walnut, engraved with quiet depth. Sergeant First Class Lila Hartley, Comms Lead, Operation Warden Sky. She spoke when needed. She watched when others forgot how. A small switch below the plaque powered a tiny light, illuminating her name at dusk. The base commander himself was seen standing before it that evening, alone, hands behind his back, eyes damp. Word spread fast that a new policy would be implemented. Each incoming seminar class would begin not with a lecture, but by reading her citation aloud. The tradition began that very night. But Lila? She didn't stay for the ceremony. She left before lunch, slipping out quietly the way she had come, through the side door, carrying nothing but her old satchel and the folded citation from Jules. Someone asked where she went, and Colonel Mathers replied, she went back to the only place she ever wanted to be, out of the spotlight, and ahead of her time. But a few sharp-eyed officers noticed something unusual as she left. A convoy of blacked-out SUVs had pulled to the curb, unannounced, doors held open by uniformed guards. It wasn't base security. It was DC. They say someone at the Pentagon had finally read the original operation log in full. Word had traveled up, fast. A quiet correction in the National Ledger was being made. Lila never confirmed where she was going. She never needed to. But weeks later, a small report in a defense journal noted a classified meeting titled, Unrecognized Assets, Revisiting Silent Service Records. Beside that title, only one name was listed in attendance. Hers. Back at the seminar building, Specialist Jules now wore a silver oak leaf pinned beside his ID badge, not regulation, but permitted by special order. It was her insignia, carved from wood and gifted by her before she left. He teaches new recruits now, and he begins each class with the same sentence. You may forget dates, ranks, tactics, but never forget who is watching when no one clapped. Lila Hartley never returned to teach again. She didn't need to. Her lesson was already written into every syllabus, every after-action debrief, every silence that followed an arrogant smirk. She was never loud, but she was never missed again. Not by those who truly learned. And now, when a young officer rolls their eyes at someone in a faded uniform sitting quietly in the back of a room, someone always leans over and whispers, "Don't make the Hartley mistake." And they listen.